Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Jimmy Brown. I hope you're having a great day today. Want to make a quick little video for you here to talk a little bit about interview questions and how we develop those and how we use those. Because we're doing qualitative research, the quality of our interview questions or focus groups, if that's what you're doing, can make a huge difference in the quality of what data we get back, how we can analyze it, and the insights we're using. So the first thing we want to talk about is what's the difference between research questions and interview questions? Because this is actually a question, something that gets a lot of people confused sometimes, particularly newer researchers. And let's start off with research questions are really the two or three overarching things that our study is trying to solve. So, we want to know if experience with one thing causes people to feel a certain way, or whether people perceive something this way or that way. These are the overarching questions. These are not what we're going to ask to our subjects. They're kind of the overall things that our study is going to answer. Interview questions, by converse, in the simplest example, are things we're going to ask directly to our subjects. Tell me about a time where you did X or you did Y. Tell me about your experience with something. Now, one thing a lot of folks feel like is they say, well, I've done interviews at my workplace for people to come join me for a job. I should know what I'm doing with interviews for research. Common misinterpretation, and having done a lot of both, I'll tell you, they're very different. In particular, with a job interview, you're trying to figure out one thing is, do you want that person for that job? Yes or no, very simple. And all of your questions are focused around that one particular thing. Do they have the skills to do the job? Or at least they should be focused around that. With interview questions for research, it's usually broader. We can go a lot of other different directions. And we're usually driven, which we'll talk in a minute about how they're tied to our research questions and they're tied to our theoretical base. Now, people say, do I have to have a theoretical base to do research? Well, there's debates about that as far as, whether you're doing a PhD or an EDD or some other kind of practical degree. But realistically, you do always need something like that because, number one, it guides your structure of your questions so it kind of keeps you focused on where you need to be. Number two, if you're doing, say, a thesis or a dissertation, the question that they always ask you, what's your theory? And if you don't have a theory, if you're not using your theory for your interview questions, then what's the point of the theory? So that in that case, it becomes more like just program evaluation rather than, say, actual research. So let's look at an example here. If you watch my video about research questions, one of the examples that I used was a practical problem of nursing professional organizations saying there's going to be a shortage of qualified nurses in 10 years, which they've been saying that for at least last 20, and showing that there's a research problem of it is not known how registered nurses perceive organizational support structures with their intended state. So that was the research problem. And we'll imagine that we found some literature that says we need to research more to that. We found our gap, all that kind of stuff. We'll just pretend like all that's here. And that led down to our two research questions, which is how do RNs perceive factors of structural empowerment influencing their intent to stay in their jobs next 5 years? And then also how do nurses perceive job satisfaction influencing their intent to stay in the next 5 years? And so those are our two research questions. We're not asking those to RNs, but we're using those to drive what we are going to ask them, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Now, as we mentioned in our last example, we did some research and found that we looked at Cantor's structural equation theory on structural empowerment, was a good theory, and also Hertzberg's two-factor theory. And again, this is not the exact example because I couldn't share that for obvious reasons. But this is evolved from an actual study I did a few years ago with a student that I chaired who she successfully completed her dissertation. But she was looking at these factors and applied them in this way. So how do we use these to develop our research questions? Now, there's a lot of different opinions on this, a lot of different ways to do it. I'm going to show you the way I have my students do it. And what we do is we use what I like to call the research question matrix. Now, you can use this, you cannot use this, but if you notice here, there's a couple of things. And I'm going to see if I can make the pen work here. Let's see here. There we go. We use big red pen here. Over here, you'll see we've got our research questions. So RQ1, RQ2, down here. And you'll see over here we got our theory. Now, with our theories, what we're saying is we're looking at this and we're talking about Cantor's structural equation theory. And just so you know, these research questions are overly simplistic. There's a lot fewer than you usually have. That's just for an example. And we look over here and we say, for example, let's say, how do you describe your structural equation experience as a nurse, or your experience of structural empowerment as a nurse? Now, part of our research protocol would be to explain what structural empowerment is. And we also have some drill downs here. These would be our drill downs. We would say, tell me more about if they mentioned, informal power or opportunity or things like that. Now, would we ask them about those? Maybe or maybe not. But a couple of things I want you to notice here is we're not saying, do you think that this has an impact? We would say, how would you describe your impact? We ask that because what we want to do is we want to get their impressions. And there's actually a great psychologist named Ed Schein. He's up at MIT. I think he may have actually retired now. And I haven't been able to find where he actually said this in writing, but I've heard him say live a couple of times, if you want an honest answer, don't ask a direct question. So we're not going to say to folks, is structural empowerment causing you to stay? No, we're going to ask them things about it. We'll get that input. Just like down here, we'll say, tell me about a time where you have been very satisfied with your job as a nurse. Just to get some examples of that. Now, there's one place where research interview versus a job interview would be similar, because you're not going to say, tell me X, Y, or Z. You'll say, tell me about a time. Give me an example. And want them to get into that kind of depth. And again, this kind of worked out this way, although it's not always this way. You've got your RQ1 is looking kind of at your theories up here, or RQ2 is kind of looking with Hertzberg. And then down here at the bottom, we've got some probing questions. Again, these indents of the probes. We're saying things like, provide some specific examples of difficult staying motivated, and then linking that back to the different aspects of structural empowerment, i.e., power, opportunity, resources, things like that. And what this does is, I'm going to see if I can erase these here real quick. Let's see here. How do we get, let's see, pointer, erase on the slide. So if we look at all this, you'd say, well, what's the point of this, this matrix? Well, it does two things for us. Number one, it makes sure that we have research questions to cover all of our RQs. Oops, there's pointer, hang on, there we go. And that's actually really, really important, because I'll tell you, I've reviewed probably 150, 200 qualitative research projects over the last few years that have been chaired by other folks. One of my roles, I review them for one of the schools I work for. And one of the worst things that can happen is that you have a bunch of interview questions and none of them address one of your research questions. And that happens more than you think. So using this matrix helps you make sure that you've got at least a few questions to address your various RQs. Number two, it also makes sure that you have your theories addressed. So for example, the Cantor structural equation theory, I would actually, if I was doing this for real, I would actually have these subcomponents of that down here and make sure we have questions for each one of those to make sure they all link up. And again, over here, you also make sure if we had some research questions that did not, if we had some interview questions that did not tie to any particular RQ, we would want to take those out of our interview protocol for two reasons. Number one, it would waste the subject's time, and the worst thing you can do is do that, because you get fatigued and they'll just, they'll not participate. Number two, there's actually been an evolution of what's called the common rule that impacts academic research. That some people interpret that as you can't ask questions you don't intend to use. So you want to make sure you don't have any questions in your interview protocol that you don't have a real need for. So for example, with this, we wouldn't go want to ask them about, I don't know, parking or something, unless we could tie it back to one of these aspects that we have in our theory or one of our research questions. So that's about it. Hope you found that useful. And if you have any questions, don't be shy about leaving the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want the channel. And if there's other topics you want me to cover, feel free to leave me a comment. I'll put it on the list and try to get to that later. Hope all is well. See you guys later.